Originally introduced as a small science vessel by Starfleet during the late 23rd century, the Oberth class has gone on to have a long and storied career, with a steady stream of variants and modernization programs leading to an extensive number of subclasses and variants of the original design, serving with first Starfleet and then a large number of civilian and Federation member world organizations. Originally measuring in at 200 meters long, 105 meters wide, and 58.5 meters tall, dimensions of the basic design would vary considerably from one subclass to another. In its original science vessel configuration, the Oberth class was only lightly armed, being equipped with a pair of small phaser banks to allow the ship good coverage all around, though the power of these weapons was limited. On rare occasions, and with some minor modifications, the class could carry photon torpedoes, firing them via the ship's probe launch systems, though this was quite rare. The class was not anticipated to undertake missions which would require significant speed. As a result, initial Oberth-class ships were capable of traveling at only the comparatively slow speed of warp factor 7, with the initial design of the class featuring a warp reactor located in the large service hull. Later, in the 24th century, this would change when modern versions of the class moved the warp reactor into a redesigned saucer section. It would be from this redesign that the majority of the many variations of the Oberth class would spring. Finally, the initial design of the class featured a modular habitation zone, which would permit multiple different internal configurations, with wide variance in the ratio of crew living space, scientific lab spaces, equipment stores, and the like. As a result, crew for the class varied wildly from ship to ship, and mission to mission depending on operational requirements. At a minimum, 34 crew were required to properly man the vessel and conduct all necessary operations for the adequate running of the ship itself, and the Oberth had sufficient life support systems to allow a crew of around 100, but, as mentioned, these figures would vary wildly during the life of a ship. Prior to the Oberth class, science vessels in Starfleet service tended to be quite large, sophisticated, and expensive vessels with large crews, with many researchers, scientists, and lab spaces aboard to make use of the ship's extensive sensor suite to study all manner of stellar science, planetary geology, gravitic forces, various forms of radiation, planetary atmospheric conditions, planetary xenobiology, xenoanthropology, and xenozoology if possible. In short, science vessels prior to the Oberth were one-stop shops, possessing the capability to study anything and everything you could reasonably expect to encounter while studying a given star system. These very advanced ships would typically be deployed on a prolonged mission with a course charted prior to their departure, which would have them stopping over at several star systems during their cruise, staying in each system for several months, and conducting all studies and experiments largely on ship before moving on to the next system of interest. However, for all of the perceived efficiency of this approach, existing science ships conducted their research at a very slow, you could even say glacial pace, and in practice it was often found that a majority of equipped labs a ship may have would have very little to do after the first few weeks of a mission, with a lot of data typically being gathered by the starships which had originally charted a system. By the 2270s, Starfleet's most recent class of science ships, the Shen Kuo class, originally designed in the later half of the 2240s, were beginning to show their age, and the question of replacement began to be considered by Starfleet Command. Originally, it was intended to follow conventional practice at the time and build another class of equally large and sophisticated ships to replace them in service, with as many as a dozen vessels being proposed, though more realistically half that number were deemed likely to be built. These initial assumptions would be thrown on their head, though, when the Cochrane shipyards in the Alpha Centauri system proposed a radically different design to answer the bid for a new science vessel put forward by Starfleet Command in 2273. The Cochrane shipyard's design would be a very small ship, just 120 meters long, with minimal space provided for crew and researchers. Instead, their proposed ship was equipped with a vast array of sensors and other instruments, with the intention being that these ships would be sent into an interesting star system, allow their instruments time to make readings and gather data, and then they would return home, where the information would be processed by experts throughout the Federation. The Cochrane design team would defend their choice by stating that existing science vessel design was very inefficient and needlessly complicated, and that by building smaller ships which focused mostly on gathering readings, the rate at which scientific study could be done would be vastly increased. Also pointing out that prior to the 4 Years' War, Starfleet had often employed scout vessels to perform a similar role, saving the bigger science ships for more interesting systems. But, following the war, the scout had fallen largely out of fashion, the lineage being evolved into the destroyer type during the war. Cochrane would gradually gain traction for their design within Starfleet's senior staff, with their arguments and reasoning being generally accepted as sound, and even echoing sentiment within the leadership made at the time. However, some changes were requested to be made to the design. Namely, Command wished for the ship to be capable of conducting some research in system, requesting that a modular design be developed if possible to allow the number and type of lab spaces to be changed as needed. Cochrane engineers would make the desired changes, though this would result in significant alteration to the original design, producing a far larger, though still quite small ship, with more comfortable crew facilities and a longer endurance as well as the included lab spaces. After reviewing all submissions, the Cochrane bid would be selected as the next class of science ship by Starfleet Command in 2275, with production of a prototype being authorized in the next year and trialed in 2277. After completing her shakedown cruise successfully, the USS Oberth would be accepted into Starfleet service in 2278, with full production of the design beginning at several major shipyards later that year. The initial batch of Oberth-class ships would enter service with the First Fleet based at Seoul, with all ships assigned to survey and research missions within the Federation's established areas of control. The class's light armament and limited protection discouraging senior command from even considering sending any ships into regions which put the vessels at even moderate risk. Despite these precautions, the USS Grissom would be lost in orbit of the Genesis planet to a surprise Klingon attack in 2285. The Klingon Empire claiming Grissom was involved in secret Federation weapons tests and thus a legitimate target. The ship's loss would cause an uproar in the Federation, with many accusing the Empire of murder, with tensions rising briefly very close to open warfare before dying down in the aftermath of the whale probe crisis. Despite this mark against them, the Oberth class proved itself to be very popular in service with their crews, with research and scientific organizations who often sent personnel aboard the ships during missions finding much to appreciate with the design. The ships proved to be very reliable, with pleasant handling characteristics far removed from the often challenging ships of the rest of the fleet in the period, while the modularity of the design would also go a long ways towards their generally well-regarded reputation within the fleet. It would be the ship's modularity that would attract the attentions of the fleet at large as the 2280s wore on, with several programs which took advantage of the class's system of replaceable mission-specific modules to transform Oberths into several variants, far removed from the ship's origins as a scientific research vessel. Indeed, by the end of the decade, a second batch of ships would be ordered specifically to perform the roles of transport, courier, medical supply ship, communications ship, and multiple other roles. These ships would appear little different from the original batch of Oberths, mostly having changes done to their internal structure in the form of different modules being accepted rather than the scientific-based modules of the original designs. The new missions the Oberth could now perform thanks to its new mission modules could not have come at a better time. During the late 2280s, Starfleet had begun retiring the vast majority of the ships constructed during the 2240s. Ships which had long since been superseded in frontline roles by later designs, being relegated to the kinds of behind-the-frontline duties that the new Oberth variants could perform. These ships had reached the end of the useful service lives of their space frames after decades of hard use, making their disposal necessary. The coincidence of Oberth suddenly having an enhanced mission package could thus not have come at a better time for Starfleet, and as a result, large numbers of Oberth-class ships would be ordered in the late 2280s and 2290s. Later, because of how many Oberths there were, and how useful the class was, Starfleet would introduce a major refit program to the class in the 2310s and 20s. The refit program would see ships of the class largely gutted, with their components replaced by more modern equivalents. The most notable change to the class made during this period would be the installation of a much smaller, though still more powerful, warp core, permitting ships of the class so refitted to achieve much higher and more useful warp speeds. This new smaller core was moved from the original reactor's location in the service hull to the saucer section, taking up the space previously occupied by the original design's impulse reactor. Most original batch Oberth hulls would receive these refits, and indeed, a large second production run would be ordered in the 2320s and 30s, with the class being made available to civilian research organizations and other bodies for the first time. With this significant boost in performance and numbers, the Oberth class would continue in service into the 2360s, though the ships would begin to be phased out of active Starfleet service during the period, due to the design's cramped interior, low speed, and limited armament. In Starfleet service, the new Nova-class science vessels would fulfill largely the same role as the legacy Oberths, at least in the science vessel mission profile, while a whole new generation of transports, medical ships, and courier vessels would be introduced in the buildup of the fleet during the 2350s and 60s. Indeed, by the 2370s, the Oberth would be almost entirely replaced in Starfleet, though many ships would continue with civilian organizations for decades to come. The class, as a result, largely missed out in seeing service during the Dominion War. During the ship's life, many dozens of variants and subclasses would be introduced, with the most notable variants proving to be the Trevithick-class tugs, Bartholomew Roberts-class attack ships, and the Marconi-class communications ships, though many other designs existed, with a majority coming into service following the refit program when the service hull was made redundant, as the reactor was moved into the saucer. This opened up the possibility of using the mass and space previously occupied by the service hull for multiple other modules as needed. While the Oberth was never the most glamorous or advanced ship in the fleet, it cannot be denied that the class proved itself to be a serviceable, easily adaptable, and popular design. True, it did lack much in the way of defense or combat power. However, given the missions initially envisioned for the ship to perform, this could be argued to be a feature rather than a flaw. The ships gave good service, and with frequent updates, the class would remain viable in the missions the class performed best, and many more, for nearly a century. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, give it a like, all the things that YouTubers are always pestering their viewers to do. Also, if you enjoy the artwork made for the video by me that you can see in the thumbnail and some other places, you can find that on the channel's Patreon. That's linked below. The artwork is actually free, but Patreon is just a convenient place to put things. So I have. Let's see, what else? Big thanks to the Patreon supporters, by the way. Yeah, so this video, I really like the Oberth. You'll notice in the beginning of the video, I list the ship as being 200 meters long, though in some quote-unquote official, but not really official material, the class is 120. I have a whole video on that, a couple of months old, talking about how big the ship is, and I kind of conclude that it's 200 meters just because at 200 meters you have space to actually have stuff. And at 120 meters, the ship is incredibly cramped and not unlivable, but like it would be very unpleasant to live in. Also, hopefully at some point I will get back to making progress. I'm building an Oberth class in Minecraft, and occasionally I'll post updates of that project on the channel's Patreon, so there'll be a dedicated video there. So that's another perk of being a Patreon member. I have not had the time to do that recently, but it is something I want to get back to. Also, I need to figure out how to record that, because the last time that I played, I had a different device and different means of recording, and now I don't have that device. I'm sure I can work something out. It'll be no janky than it was before. But, yeah, regardless, thank you very much for watching. Thanks for making it to this point, which is a little bit weird, but I appreciate it. Like, why would you be still watching at this point? Jeez.